on this Thursday morning. So as Tracy alluded to, the topic for Master Data Series 2 is the technical delivery for S4 HANA Data Migration. What we will do is just go through the agenda points, and we will talk about the agenda for today. Sorry, we're just having issues with our slide deck. We'll talk about the agenda for today. So I'll quickly just go through GlueData services, who we are, our core solutions and our core technology. And then I'll hand over to Paul McCormick, who's the expertise in this field, and he'll go through the content of today's presentation. He'll have a look at the S4 data migration, have a look at SAP's data migration tools, and have a look at the considerations when selecting the tools. We also have a look at GlueData's data migration methodology. We've been involved in multiple of migration projects, and we've really built our own methodology around that, which can add huge value to clients. So I know Paul's got a packed agenda and a packed slide deck. So I'll go through GlueData, who we are, very quickly, and then I'll hand over to Paul. So we were founded in 2011, became a silver partner in 2014, and very proud of the SAP recognized expertise label that we have for GlueData. And we are recognized expertise in the information, so the enterprise information management silo that SAP puts us into. And there are only 6 of us globally, so we're the only one in Africa, and extremely proud of that recognition. And in 2020, we became a SAP Gold partner, and we also opened up offices in Europe in 2020. So definitely there's a global reach. All companies across the globe have issues with data, and we're involved in numerous global projects, from master data governance to the data migration. So extremely proud of and excited about opening up our offices in Europe. So really the key value and the key message around GlueData is, data drives processes, and processes drives profitability. So very focused, very niche in terms of the data elements of SAP. And important to know that we also only have SAP partners. So very, very focused in terms of what we do. The next slide I'd like to go through is going through our core technologies and methodologies. And what I'll do, keep skipping over. I'll first focus on the vertical pillars. So there are 5 main pillars which we focus on from data migration. That's the pillar that Paul will focus on today. We also look at data management and data quality. Really having a look at the management of data at a field level, getting that data clean and keeping the data clean. Data integration and insights, having a look at data profiling, your BI insights around your data, and understanding how that impacts on your business. Data governance, very important, to have your data governance in place in a company. I think the key here is that we can really supply tools and the KPI type of dashboards that help that data governance conversation. And the last vertical pillar is the data archiving and information lifecycle management, which is really completes the whole lifecycle management of data. In this slide, we've got blocks highlighted in red and highlighted in grey. The red blocks are GlueData's products and our methodologies, where the blocks in grey are SAP products. So you can see that from an SAP stack, we focus on SAP Master Data Governance, SAP Information Steward, SAP Data Services. Obviously, SAP HANA is obviously important layer across all those verticals. And then also the ILM and SAP Data Volume Management. The 2 horizontals are your data assessments and roadmaps. So often we go in to clients and we can focus on any of these verticals just to assess where they currently are and really help them build a roadmap in terms of making sure that we align with their business strategy and to make sure that the data is up to date and kept clean, and we get it clean. So very much an overview of our solutions and core tech. From here on, I know, Paul, you're under time pressure, so I'm extremely excited to hear Paul's slide deck. So I'm gonna hand over to Paul, but just before we do that, there is a base question prize. We'll get a GlueData power bank to that person. So please feel free to ask questions. It's just in terms of around that. If you've got a question, just please put your hand up on the chat, and then I'll stop Paul at the best time, and then we can answer the questions. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the session. But as I say, if you've got a question during the presentation, please put your hand up, and I will watch that and alert Paul of that. So the previous winner of the power bank was Leanne from BCX from the Master Data Series 1. At that point, Paul, I will stop my control and I'll hand over to you.
Good, thank you, Jono. Yeah, and welcome to everybody on the call. I'm just going to jump straight into it. There's quite a lot to get through, and I don't want to run out of time. So I think the objective of what I'm trying to achieve with the audience here today is just to give an idea of all the different sort of tools that SAP has made available within the SAP EIM stack to deal with data migration, as well as integration, but we're going to focus on data migration specifically today, and just maybe try and bring a little bit more clarity in terms of when you typically use which tool. I know that there can be quite a lot of confusion amongst customers out there sometimes when they feel or they think that the tools kind of overlap and they don't really know which space each tool plays. So let's just talk about the positioning of these specific tool sets. I think that it's a really important consideration to give really early on in a project, even in the commercial discussions, data migration project. It's very important. I have been involved in quite a lot of projects, actually on the execution side. So I can speak from experience that I know what the pain feels like when you are to do the delivery and you don't sit with the right tool at the end of the day to execute that delivery. So, why do I sort of say that? Typically because, tool set differs whether it's whether the ERP system is on-premise or whether it's cloud-based. Build and execution methodology is often very much driven in terms of what can be achieved by the specific tool set, resources and their skill sets. So it's resources within the customer and resources in terms of consulting partners that that is employed to execute. So very seldom you find that consultants who have expertise in all the tool sets on offer by SAP to use the data migrations. So in the initial onsets of planning a data migration project, you got to think about what are the tools and do we have resources for those tools? Then very important component is the loading mechanism to get the data into S4HANA. That is a big decider on the tool that's going to be used. Volumes of data, whether they're large or small. Is the source data coming from an existing SAP system or a non-SAP system? And what is the quality of the current data like? Will transformation be light or heavy? So those are, some of the main reasons that you should be thinking about pre-heading into a data migration project. So from experience, we have found that majority of our clients have not really been spoken to on a technical level about the data migration tools on offer and what would best suit their data migration project. In this presentation, like I said, I'm trying to aim to address that knowledge gap by providing you with an overview of SAP's most common data migration tools. We also share aspects that we think you need to consider when selecting from those tools. What are the main benefits when choosing the right tool? There are many benefits in choosing a specific tool, but if I had to isolate the main benefits, I would really say that speeding up the technical element of the data migration build, identifying data errors and issues early on in the build, and being able to feed that back to business very early on, and then finding the most effective way to automate data transformations. And when you combine these three benefits, you can dramatically reduce the overall risk of data migration. And we do understand in the larger program, data migration needs to be treated as a critical activity. And if it's not, it can be quite disastrous to the overall project that needs to be executed successfully. So what are the main tools that we'll be looking at and discussing today? SAP Data Services, also known as SAP DS, SAP Information Steward, SAP IS, normally referred to, LSMW, known as your Legacy System Migration Workbench. We'll talk a little bit about support around that in S4HANA a little bit later. SAP Migration Cockpit, SAP Agile Data Preparation, SAP SDI, which is SAP HANA Smart Data Integration, which is on-premise and cloud platform SDI offering, and then SAP Smart Data Quality. So in the picture above that you can see here includes most of the tools we will consider and aims to highlight where the tools fit in against two dimensions, target systems and whether cloud or on-premise. So if you look at this diagram over here, you will see that everything to the left is basically SAP agnostic, and then split above the orange line, you kind of have a SAP agnostic tool that is on-premise, is SAP Data Services and SAP Information Steward. And in the cloud, you have data quality management, microservices available to you. These are SAP agnostic, so they don't necessarily have to sit within a SAP environment. So for argument's sake, you could use these tools in a data warehousing environment. And then when we're looking at a cloud offering that is SAP HANA based, you would look towards Agile Data Preparation, which is software as a service in the cloud. And then the SAP HANA SDI and SDQ tools. So as you can see, each one of these, they might have overlapping functionalities between each other, but they sit in quite a bit of a different space. And you're gonna kind of look at what are the requirements in your project to to utilize these tools. Sometimes they work together as a team, and sometimes in certain instances you can use them in their individual capacity. So let's look a little bit closer at SAP Data Services and Information Steward and their typical use case. You would use SAP DS when you've got substantial data volumes and when there's a large number of data sources or targets. Typically, data service is very strong and is a very matured product, and therefore has a lot of data sources pre-built into the tool that can be connected to. When you're dealing with complex transformation requirements, including deduplication, SAP Data Services together with Information Steward can be a really powerful team in terms of tool usage. Requirement to perform analysis of the data ahead of the data migration, which in my opinion is always a great idea. Where data quality reporting is needed, either as once-off or as a continuous activity. Data services can load data directly to SAP, making use of an IDOC or a BAPI. If a SAP load program is used as a loading mechanism, then data services can output a text file. And data services can also load to HANA staging schema to be used by Migration Cockpit. Or if the volumes are low for Migration Cockpit, you can load to file and import that via Migration Cockpit. When migrating to a target S/4HANA system, this is only possible with an on-premise system. If used, if a cloud target is used, the load step would be performed using Migration Cockpit rather than direct via SAP DS. But you can still use DS to perform, the E and the T and the ETL and prep your data as ready as possible, and then have Migration Cockpit load that in the cloud. SAP Information Steward is a tool for data analysis, profiling, and dashboard reporting. And SAP IS is often used together with SAP DS when the project has data assessment and data quality related tasks.
Paul, can I just stop you there?
Yep.
We've got two questions. Let's have a look at those questions. Vandran has asked, can you also mention the capabilities of MDG data loading options in contrast to those SAP tools that you have mentioned already? I mean, I could potentially talk about MDG, but if you'd like to answer that question.
Well, so are we asking what, are they, can they do similar tasks? Are they, or are we wanting to know how does SAP Data Services sit together with MDG?
Yeah. Pravandran, can you unmute yourself and can you just answer Paul's questions? I'll just give my 2 cents here. MDG certainly we don't see it as a pure data migration tool. It definitely is a master data management and a tool once a client is live on S4, for example, and it can also be used as a cleansing tool to clean data and source. But would you just like to unmute yourself and just go into a bit more detail in terms of your question?
Also, Paul, just curious if the MDG functionality has the capability to load data into SAP for migration, or should we use the tools that you listed previously?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not really an expert on the MDG loading side, but no, I wouldn't think that you would use MDG to load data for a data migration perspective. I mean, if you think about it, in a large-scale data migration, there's lots of objects that needs to be covered. And MDG only deals with certain objects at this point in time, to my knowledge. But if you think about in data migration, all the the real benefits that you get out of using a tool like data services, for example, where you can first of all stage data from multiple sources, then join the data, apply rules, business rules on those data, validate all that data, all those functions that forms part of a data migration project. I don't see MDG being a product that you can do any of that sort of functionality from a migration perspective.
Great, thanks,
that
Paul.
Kind of answers your question.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Paul. Ansel, I've also got a question. Hi, Paul. Can you also just elaborate on the licensing specifically around ADP?
No, sorry, Ansel, I can't.
Yeah.
The licensing model that SAP uses is very complex, as you know, and I can probably my expertise lies more around data services and IS licensing, but I think ADP you would need to talk directly to SAP on that licensing. Even what I think I know around SAP Data Services and Information Steward around licensing. Normally, is a bit different because it's very complex when it comes to SAP's licensing model.
Great. And so answer the last question, and then we need to move on. Also, can you clarify the use cases master data migration versus transaction migration?
Sure.
Sorry, Paul, that was basically just when do you use which tool for, will you use data services for both master data transaction and transactional migration? Just clarify the different use cases. So when would you typically use which tool?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that you would use a specific tool, for whether it's master data or transactional data. In my mind, you use a tool for your data migration project based on a whole lot of variables within your project. But I would definitely not split up tools. These objects between master data components and transactional data, they're very interlinked with one another. And, there's a lot of dependencies for the transactional data on master data. You typically want that all to sit within one environment. I think it's probably a conversation that we could spend quite a bit of time around, but just in short, because of the interdependencies between transactional data to back to the master data, I would definitely not split them from a tool usage perspective.
Thanks.
Right, so should we go on to the next slide?
Please do, Paul. I'll stop you if more questions come through.
All right. So SAP Migration Cockpit is a relatively new tool released by SAP, and it's embedded within S/4HANA. It's both cloud and on-premise versions. It is positioned for use in transformation and loading of data into S/4HANA. SAP Migration Cockpit takes data held in a predefined data template format, either in spreadsheets or in a staging database. To these, it applies then value mapping, some technical validation, and reporting and technical, and can do some reporting on some of the technical validation issues experienced. It uses standard load APIs developed by SAP. An important note that I'd like to make is that we definitely see the use of SAP Migration Cockpit as an entirely complementary to the use of SAP Data Services. As we would typically recommend the separation between the transformation and load steps of ETL. It is fully compatible with SAP's ADP, as this uses the same data templates to construct data for loading. So, I see amongst the customers out there often, some confusion that comes out of, the understanding of where does that SAP Data Services fit in with Migration Cockpit, especially after, some sales presentations were made by the oaks that do the sales. More often than not, I kind of see that guys say, we're using Migration Cockpit to do our migration. And I'm like, no, you're using Migration Cockpit to load your data. So it is not an ETL product. It is a loading mechanism. If you have really low volumes of data that needs hardly any transformation, and I would say is coming from a SAP system already, then you could maybe get away with only using Migration Cockpit. But any form of sort of, medium to complex transformation coming from a non-SAP environment with fairly decent sized volumes, you're going to need an ETL tool to prep that data before it goes into Migration Cockpit. So typically, replaces LSMW. It's close, but not exactly. It works well in combination with SAP Data Services, as I said, particularly when loading data in a cloud-based S/4HANA system. And I say that because SAP Data Services can't load directly into a cloud-based system, but it can provision the data, work with the data, get it data migration SAP ready for you, and then use Migration Cockpit to load that. It can be used to standalone, like I said, on low complexity data, minimal transformation. It doesn't require any separate infrastructure as it runs in the same environment as the data to be loaded in. SAP Transaction LTMC starts up your Migration Cockpit for you. Can load data using XML templates, which is file-based. That's really small data volumes, and it's a copy and paste process. I personally have some reservations around that because it's interference with the data, and from a governance perspective, it's debatable. Can load data using HANA schema. For me personally, this is the preferred method. What that does mean, though, is that it does have some licensing issues around it. If you are sitting with HANA ERP runtime license, then you cannot use a schema within that runtime license, HANA DB, to stage the data to be used by Migration Cockpit. You would have to have a sidecar HANA DB, that you can use, and that comes with licensing issues. Reporting on the data loaded or errors during the load using Migration Cockpit is weak at this stage. Problem solving using Migration Cockpit is not easy. It's happening inside Migration Cockpit, and getting those errors that you experience out to business is very difficult. And again, going back to why using something like data services as your ETL product or your ET product, using Migration Cockpit as your loading product, that gives you the opportunity to, have as many error reporting, failures of errors, validations inside data services, which gives you the flexibility of, developing automated reports to get out to business as quick as possible, and to try and eliminate as much risk as possible for having any sort of failures within Migration Cockpit area. Let's go to the next slide. Right, so SAP ADP has been developed as a web tool that incorporates simplified versions of transforms from SAP DS to enable profiling, some cleansing, some deduplication and data preparation activities. It provides an extract and transform tool to complement the load functionality of SAP Migration Cockpit, and works best with limited volumes of data. Often customers get confused with competing SAP products. This is one of them. Some people might think that SAP IS and SAP ADP competes, but I don't believe they do. They satisfy different needs based on the customer's requirements. SAP Information Steward is a fully fledged data quality monitoring and data prep tool installed on-premise, where a customer has the need for a data quality assessment and monitoring tool before data migration or during the data migration and after go live. They would generally invest into SAP IS, where the data migration is less complex with small data volumes, but they still need or want the ability to use a tool which can assist in enhancing data quality before migration. Then the customer can look at using something like SAP ADP. Right, so SAP HANA SDI and SAP Cloud Platform SDI delivers transformation and migration or integration type capabilities as part of the SAP HANA platform. SAP HANA SDI is primarily for HANA on-premise systems, even though SAP Cloud Platform SDI can also be used. SAP SDI and STQ have much in common with SAP Data Services. It does have a similar look and feel to it, in their user interface and their functionality availability. I think that SDI is still a bit behind Data Services in terms of capabilities, especially from a transformation perspective. It's not the easiest tool to use in a development environment either. I think that's just really due to its maturity, and it will mature over time. Smart data quality is often used to report on the quality of the data and provide auto correction or enrichment of the data. So sort of typical use cases, big data source systems are in scope, and when SAP Data Services is not available. So large data volumes is not a problem for SDI. It doesn't require a separate infrastructure as it runs in the same HANA environment. Supports loading to HANA systems in a public cloud as well. And it being native to HANA to HANA products, smart data quality has very high performance and is great in processing large volumes of data. So in that respect, I would say that's a definite consideration when you do have large data that you want to do data quality on. From my experience, SAP Information Steward is not great at handling large data volumes. It can connect to multiple sources, but can only load to HANA as a target. This is the one thing that I think when you're also looking at a tool for future use that you need to definitely consider. Often a customer would invest into one of these tools with a view on using it after data migration in building interfaces. It can assist in data analysis exercises, continue with deduplication exercises. If there's a data warehouse outside of SAP, then that tool can also be used. But SDI is very limited from that perspective because the target that you can use is only HANA, where something like data services, you've got many choices in terms of a target system. Components available for transformation, in my opinion, are still quite light and not as matured as in SAP Data Services. The interface uses Web IDE, which can, in countries where internet speeds aren't that great and latency can be an issue. And this is an issue for developers, because, they are pressed to deliver within timeframes. And when you're dealing with tools that, that has latency and slow performance, it can be problematic from a development perspective. Right, so legacy system migration workbench, LSMW. It's historically, LSMW has been one of the most widely used tools for data migration in SAP landscapes. But that's in the olden days, in my opinion, although it provides, great extraction function, extensive mapping and transformation, and the loading capabilities. And, it sort of only was limited in terms of what was possible with the ABAP programming environment. But it is really worth noting that SAP's stance on this is that LSMWs no longer support it in loading data in S/4HANA system. They work, but they're not supported by SAP. So if you look at that SAP note, you will see that SAP is quite stern about, you taking the risk onto yourself if you're loading any data objects using LSMW. So some important considerations that I think needs to be given when looking and deciding at, what tool are we going to be using. I'm not going to go through every line of this. I think you guys will get this, presentation afterwards. And this is a really important piece to kind of read through in your own time. But if I had to read every line, we're going to run out of time. But I think just as a, at the high level, like I said before, don't just, when you're looking at investing in a tool, mainly for your data migration project, I always say to the customer, also look into the future and what you might want to end up using, after data migration. It is expensive, investment to make, both from a capital perspective and from a human resources perspective, training people up. So choosing something that has longevity beyond data migration project, for me, is always a win. So, some of the main considerations, again, complexity of source and target landscapes, considering, what that complexity is, often will, have a deciding factor on the type of tool that you use, volumes and complexity of the data. How important is, performance from a migration tool perspective? What are the timelines within that, project? To what extent does the tool need to accommodate any complex interdependencies between different sets of data? That is what I was trying to touch on earlier when the question was raised about splitting, or should we use something else to do master data and something else to do, transactional data? That's pretty much what that comes down to. Different tools have different ways of storing data, and the databases, underlying databases, and now it's used. And when you're splitting these tools to do, to handle, maybe master data and transactional data differently, then how will you kind of build that, that interdependency relationship, especially from a transactional perspective, and some sort of second tier level master data objects that is dependent on the loading of other master data objects before. So, it's an important aspect to look at. Right, security and sensitivity issue requirements, also an important, especially within the financial banking environment, where there's very sensitive information, and been in a situation like this before, where it was just kind of assumed that, this will be done, and a tool was decided on, and then you get in the project, and the customer says, oh, don't forget to encrypt, this and that, and do all of these masking activities and all of that, and you're like, but this tool doesn't do that, and that's a problem. So, then all of a sudden now you've got to figure out other ways around it, start jumping outside of the tool to do a specific activity that wasn't planned properly in the beginning, and now you end up with this sort of messy environment where you've broken your own sort of methodology from a development perspective. Reuse of developments or landscapes after go live to support data quality governance. So again, if you have longevity in the product going after go live, and what do you want to do with it? Do you have data quality initiatives after go live? You might not be investing in MDG, but you want similar data governance initiatives within your business, and you need to look at how, what tool will best suit that sort of objective. Level of in-house experience and skills. This is a very important aspect to consider, not just during the data migration, but also after go live. And your sort of data migration team is left and gone onto another data migration. Do you now have the skills left to support the tool that you invested in? Are those skills available? And I also, think that it's also important to consider the skills that you employ within your data migration project. Are those skills all coming from overseas? And, what happens if we have an event in the world that limits people from being on site, for example? Can those skills work on this tool remotely, for argument's sake? And then quality of existing data, whether it's known or expected quality. Are there known deficiencies in the current data? According to the customer initially, my experience is that there aren't much known deficiencies. Their data is always good, but it's normally the opposite. The data is normally not so good and needs quite a bit of work to be done on. Will data cleanse be a single one-off exercise, or will you continue to cleanse data throughout the migration? So yeah, I mean, based on the project. Are you going to go into a pre-data cleansing exercise before, the data migration, or will you be running some sort of data migration purification project side by side with your, data migration project, and what will happen after go live? Right, so that kind of just, highlights the considerations that needs to be given when selecting a tool for your data migration project. Let's jump into the typical architecture that that GlueData would suggest as the best practice architecture for data migration. There's a lot of debate and conversation that can happen around this, but I would like to suggest that if you have a fairly large-scale data migration project that you're heading into, look at a 3-tier environment, typically with a dev, a test, or QA environment, and then a production environment. Your development environment, as I say, would be where your initial development will take place. You will typically have a data services application server joined up to a SQL server in that environment, and that will connect to your SAP dev. The same goes into QA, will connect to your SAP QA. And in our production sort of architecture, we would in production connect to pre-production as well as production. We don't have a pre-production environment within the SAP Data Services architecture. From a service spec perspective, I'm not going to go into detail, but what is important is don't scale down on your dev and your QA environments too much. I know there's commercial implications, but if you scale down too much on development, you're giving, you're giving your jockeys a donkey to try and win the July over here. So give the guys a good environment that they can speed up their development and they can make good advancements in getting that project on track and not falling behind. And then in the QA environment, from a spec perspective, I always say that your QA must match production, because how are you to know how your loads will perform in a production environment when your QA environment is not matching production? So if your QA environment is not spec the same as production, you will not necessarily know, and you won't be able to plan cut over properly from a timeline perspective when you have tested this properly in your QA. What sits outside this environment, generally, what you can see there is sort of a terminal server, or what we call a jump server, which is just another server that we make available for, for developers to log on to use data services design environment. You might have a file server if you're dealing with, sort of a lot of files in the project. And as a sidecar, you would have HANA DB in this instance, because here the design is sort of assuming that we're going to be using Migration Cockpit to do the loading of the data, and therefore we need a staging schema in a HANA DB that data services can push the SAP ready load data into a staging environment, and that will then be sucked up by Migration Cockpit. Right, so moving on from that to having sort of a look at what the data flow diagram in a data migration process would typically kind of look like. This is how GlueData kind of deals with their data migration projects. As you can see, it's broken up into a legacy data environment. We've got a data migration environment, a load mechanism, and then target. Data services typically plays, its main role in the data migration environment portion, and can also play a portion in the load mechanism part. It's dependent on what is chosen as the load mechanism for that specific project. If we look at the data migration part in this picture, you will see that the extraction from a GlueData methodology perspective is to always extract the source legacy data in a one-to-one extraction into our staging environment, where we don't apply any filters or anything. So we generally always sit with the staged data from the source environment untouched. It hasn't been changed. It's one-to-one. All right. Then we would move into some different phases with throughout our build methodology, where we deal with that stage data. We might join the data. We could possibly apply filters to filter some of the data out based on rules. We would reject data. Maybe there's some rules around rejecting specific data that might not go into S4. But they can't get rid of it out of the source environment all that easily. And then we would move into a transformation phase where we would deal with areas like the transformation of the data based on business rules, push it through into what we call a duplicate key check area, where we make sure that we don't have duplicates based on the keys of that data. And then push it into a validation environment where we would apply a whole lot of validations broken up into validations that deals with, checking config, checking cross-object validation, and then from that our reporting will kick out all the different errors that relates to the rules that was written in the validation phase. And then lastly, after that, if we're dealing with an object that's got multiple segments, where we've, for argument's sake, got headers and some detailed segments, we would do some orphan checking and making sure that we've got alignment between the different segments of the data, and then push the data into the chosen loading mechanism. Right, so if I had to just, show for those guys that do have some understanding of data services and see, just what would this look like in a data services design. GlueData has, taken a lot of the RDM objects available by SAP, and we've built our own sort of enhanced RDM templates where we feel that, the RDM doesn't necessarily cater for specific areas within their builds. So, our templates are based on some parts of the SAP RDM, but enhanced in quite a few areas. So if you had a quick look at this, you could see that we've got staging area, we've got an area where we filter the data, join the data, reject the data. We've got an area where transformations will take place, as I said, duplication checking, and then our validation area. And I would say out of the RDM, this is probably the area that we're using the RDM components most, because RDM has got many pre-delivered rules already written for many objects. So we would utilize that in there. And then obviously the enrichment and orphan checking and loading of that data. And last but not least, in the design, after this has all happened, we will be dealing with reconning that data and making sure that what we've received, we've actually ended up loading into the target. Right, so let's, as far as reporting is concerned, GlueData, has pre-delivered templates from a reporting perspective. Project to project, there might be some specific requirements, but generally from a rollout implementation perspective, off the bat, we would provide KPI audit reporting, where we have automated reporting showing row counts of source to SAP target. This is not just important for, feeding back KPI results back to the customer. It's actually also really important to speed up development for the technical guy, because he uses this reporting to quickly identify areas within his development where data is falling out and where problem areas of the data could be, could exist. Then we have our error reporting, which, will report back to the customer on all errors that we have within our data services environment. So we'll report on rejected data, make sure the customer agrees with that rejected data. We report on filtered data, make sure that the rule around the filtering is correct. And then obviously important around all the validation errors and the business rules that was defined in our technical document where, and make sure that the rule is delivering as expected. Then, you'd have some business sign-off reporting. There are objects which require more information than just row count audits between data services and the SAP target. So some automated quantity and value reporting for specific data objects to ensure all checks and balances have been met. So that really covers at a high level, the three main reporting areas. Let's just have a look at some interesting figures. So recently, using a 3-tier data services landscape, in that sort of environment, we used Microsoft SQL Server as our staging DB. I have been asked before, can we use HANA as staging? And yes, you can use HANA as staging, but it's a conversation that we would need to take up, because in a migration project, data can grow. Often customers say, yeah, but we don't have much data. But when I get into a conversation explaining, but it's not just that you don't have much data. Even if you've got 10,000 materials, we stage it. We've got the same 10,000 that's gone through into transformation, the same 10,000 that's gone through validation, the same 10,000 that's gone into duplicate key checking. And so you can see how the data grows. And with HANA, costing you more money, the more data you put in it, it's a commercial decision that needs to be taken in terms of, is it more commercially viable to use SQL Server as the main staging component and a much smaller instance of HANA just for the final data staging for argument's sake, Migration Cockpit. And that might just be, through the data migration project, commercially more viable. In this specific project, we used a few different loading mechanisms, IDOCs. We had some custom programs, and we had some LSMWs, not many, I think 3 or 4 maybe. It consisted of about 77 ERP data objects migrated to S/4HANA, 38 objects, which was migrated from an Oracle data warehouse to a HANA DB for BW consumption. And, the total sort of data that we dealt with in the data migration project was 8 terabytes of data, close to just over 40 billion rows of data was migrated using this sort of architecture and methodology described using data services. And in this landscape, IS Information Steward was also used with some cleansing activities, both before and during the data migration. So that really kind of brings me to the end, and I think we're basically kind of running out of time over here. I hope that the information provided added some extra value to you guys in considering the tool well in advance and even in the planning from a commercial perspective. So, Jono, I'm going to hand over back to you.
Great, Paul, thank you very much. That was seriously informative, and I really hope everybody gained some insight into the data migration methodology. So before we talk about the next master data series, there is some time for some questions. I know there have been some questions that have been asked already, but please, if you've got any questions now, please unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, Paul, seems like all the questions have been answered during the presentation. Paul, thank you very much again. The next Master Data Series 3 will be held on the 17th of September at 9 o'clock. And the title of that will be Master Data Management with GlueData's Simple Data Management Tool. So we look forward to Wimpy Hazer, who will be the guest speaker around that. We'll talk about Simple Data Management and then actually also do a demo of the solution. So we look forward to that. So please join us for our next Master Data Series on the 17th of September. And please, if you've got any further details or if you'd like to ask a few more questions, both myself and Paul's details are on the slide. As Paul alluded to earlier, the slide deck will be shared on that AFSUG webpage. But if you got any further details, please contact myself or Paul. and we'll obviously happy to assist with any further questions.
Thanks, Jono. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, that's all.
Hi guys, so thanks so much. I'll be logging off this call and switching off the meeting, and as Jono advised, it will be shared on our website. So have a great day, stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Cool. Thanks,
Thank you.
Tracy.
Bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Thank you.